A millionaire businessman walks into a coffee shop dressed as an ordinary person, facing ridicule and humiliation from his own employee. But when he reveals who he really is, the unexpected twist leaves everyone speechless. The door to the elegant cafe opened with a soft clink, and Eduardo crossed the threshold with calm steps. He was dressed in a simple shirt and worn trousers that contrasted with the opulence of the place. Warm lights illuminated the polished wooden furniture, while the aroma of freshly ground coffee permeated the air. Eduardo had chosen this spot for a brief respite before a crucial meeting that would set the course of his company. His gaze scanned the room in search of a discreet table. Finally, he sat down by a window, from where he could observe the hustle and bustle of the city. He took a small notebook out of his briefcase and began to write some notes. Each word reflected his concentration as he tried to organize his ideas for the day. At a nearby table, Clara, a young employee at Eduardo's company, was enjoying her coffee with a group of friends. Her laughter echoed in the air, a mix of confidence and disdain that did not go unnoticed. When she noticed Eduardo, her eyebrow arched in displeasure. "Who lets people like that in here?" Clara muttered, making sure her comment was audible enough. Her friends looked at her, confused at first, but then giggled as they followed the direction of her gaze. "It must be a lost delivery man," another added, causing more laughter. Eduardo didn't look up. Although he could clearly hear every word, he chose to ignore them. Patience was a virtue he had cultivated over the years, and this was not the time for confrontation. However, a slight movement in his jaw betrayed his discomfort. Clara, noticing that her comments were not receiving a response, decided to increase the tone of her mockery. "Look at the way he behaves, as if this place is for anyone. I'll bet he can't even afford a coffee here," he said, taking a sip of his drink with a haughty smile. Meanwhile, the cafe staff was busy working. Among them was Luis, a young waiter who had noticed Eduardo's presence. Although his movements were discreet, his eyes occasionally rested on the unassuming man. He recognized that face. After all, he had seen his photo in the company's internal emails. Eduardo, oblivious to Luis's gaze, continued writing in his notebook. At times, he looked up at the glass, letting the urban landscape clear his mind. His expression was serene, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of a depth and determination that few could guess at a glance. Clara's friends continued to laugh, but their attention failed to disturb the peaceful atmosphere Eduardo was trying to maintain. Although his appearance seemed modest, his bearing conveyed a silent confidence. He was a man accustomed to facing challenges far greater than the hurtful words of an arrogant young woman. Time passed, and the cafe's customers continued with their conversations and activities. Clara, however, seemed obsessed with demonstrating her supposed wit at Eduardo's expense. Ignorance of his true identity made her words even more poisonous. Without saying anything, Eduardo calmly closed his notebook. He looked at his watch and decided that he still had a few minutes to stay there. As Clara continued to talk, he reflected internally on what respect really meant and how appearances could be so deceptive. Finally, he asked for a coffee on the go with a discreet gesture, as if he were just another customer. But something in his posture, his look, or perhaps his calmness, made some people begin to question whether he was really as ordinary as his attire suggested. Clara leaned back in her chair, a superior smile on her face. Her friends exchanged knowing glances as they continued to watch Eduardo, who remained at his table, oblivious to the spectacle unfolding a few meters away. "Do you realize how he doesn't even react? It's like he doesn't understand what we're saying," Clara said, laughing, while playing with the spoon in her cup. "Or maybe he knows he has no arguments," answered one of his companions, provoking a new round of laughter. The customers at the nearby tables began to pay attention. Some, amused by the situation, joined in with mocking glances. One of them even muttered something under his breath, causing his companion to laugh discreetly. The cafe, known for its exclusive atmosphere, was beginning to fill with an uncomfortable atmosphere, where Clara's arrogance mixed with the silent complicity of the others. Eduardo, with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural, continued to review his notebook. Although his face remained impassive, inside him a mixture of emotions flared, from frustration to a slight sadness at the scene he was witnessing. He had spent too much time building his life on pillars of humility and effort, and this type of attitude always reminded him of the challenges he had faced in the past. Clara, encouraged by the apparent approval of the other customers, decided to raise the tone of her comments. Maybe he's here for inspiration. I'm sure he thinks sitting somewhere expensive will make him feel important, she said, leaning towards her friends with a mischievous glint in her eyes. One of her friends, apparently more cautious, lowered her voice a little. Clara, I think we should leave it. What if someone who knows him hears us? But Clara didn't seem worried. So what? What could someone like him do? She replied in a defiant tone. Meanwhile, Luis, the waiter, watched the scene from behind the counter. He knew Clara as a regular customer, always accompanied by her group of friends. He also knew who Eduardo was, although he had never seen him in person until that day. His discomfort grew with each word he heard. Although he wanted to intervene, he was afraid of causing a bigger problem. Eduardo, meanwhile, looked up briefly and surveyed the room. Luis's eyes met his for a moment, and the young waiter seemed to hesitate. However, Eduardo gave him a slight nod, almost imperceptible, as if he were telling him not to worry. Then he returned to his notes, leaving Luis even more confused. The murmur in the cafe intensified. Some customers, uncomfortable with what was happening, avoided looking at Clara's table. Others, however, seemed to enjoy the spectacle. Clara, confident in her position, showed no signs of stopping. She must be writing her shopping list. Maybe she dreams of one day being able to pay for something here without shuddering at the prices, he said, bursting into laughter. Eduardo remained motionless. His calm was not a sign of weakness, but of something much deeper, a lesson he was ready to teach at the right moment. Eduardo closed his notebook carefully, letting his fingers rest for a moment on the worn leather cover. Clara's words still echoed in the air, but he didn't let them break his serenity. In his mind, those taunts were more a reflection of herself than any truth about him. Yet he couldn't help but let his thoughts take him back to his own story. He had grown up in a poor neighborhood where every day was a struggle to survive. He remembered his mother, working long hours in a factory, and his father, always with rough hands from hard work. His childhood had been anything but easy, marked by material deprivation and at times the contempt of those who judged him for his origins. Those memories, although painful, had given him the strength to become the man he was today. The coffee in front of him was starting to get cold, but Eduardo was barely paying attention to it. Clara's words had made him reflect on how appearances were still a powerful barrier in society. He had built his empire with effort and dedication, but he never let success disconnect him from his roots. That simplicity, which was now the subject of ridicule, was a constant reminder of who he really was. He looked up at the window. Outside, life continued at its frenetic pace. People walked in a hurry, taxis sped by, and street vendors offered their wares. Eduardo found a kind of peace in that everyday scene, as if the outside world reminded him that there was always something bigger than the prejudices of a few. As his thoughts drifted between the past and present, he wondered again if he should intervene. Should he confront Clara and reveal who she really was? Part of him wanted to do so, not out of revenge, but to show her that appearances can be deceiving and that each person carries a unique story. However, another part of him preferred to remain silent, letting the lessons come on their own. Clara's attitude reminded him of many people he had met throughout his life, individuals who measured the worth of others by what they wore or where they lived. Eduardo had always believed that a person's true worth was not in their appearance, but in their character and actions. But now, sitting in that cafe, he realized how widespread such superficial thinking was. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs and clear his mind. He decided that, for now, he would watch. Clara's actions, and those of the others, would speak for themselves. He had learned that patience and strategy were powerful tools, even in situations as mundane as this. With a calm look, he picked up his coffee cup and took a sip. Although the liquid was no longer hot, its taste reminded him that even in the bitterest of times, there was always something to learn from. Luis, the young waiter, continued to observe the scene from the bar. Although he tried to concentrate on his work, every comment from Clara reached his ears, filling him with a mixture of discomfort and embarrassment. He had worked in that cafe for years and knew the regular customers well. Clara and her group were frequent visitors, always with a haughty and condescending air. But that man sitting by the window, dressed simply, was different. Luis knew who he was. He remembered perfectly the first time he had heard about Eduardo. Internal company emails, staff meetings, even rumors among employees painted the picture of a discreet leader, someone who didn't need to show off to command respect. Seeing him there, sitting calmly while enduring Clara's taunts, confirmed everything he had heard. However, knowing that only made Luis feel more uncomfortable. As he carried a tray of orders to another table, he couldn't help but glance at Eduardo. The man was serene, holding his coffee cup calmly, but there was something in his expression that spoke of deep thought. Luis noticed how Eduardo looked at him for a moment with a slight nod. It was a subtle gesture, but enough for Luis to understand that Eduardo didn't need him to intervene. However, the young waiter couldn't ignore the growing tension in the atmosphere. Returning to the bar, Luis pressed his lips together and glanced at Clara. Her laughter and comments seemed to have no end. Should he say something? Should he defend the man who was clearly being humiliated for no reason? But fear held him back. He knew that any intervention could trigger a conflict with Clara, who did not hesitate to show her disdain towards those she considered inferior. Luis took a deep breath and looked at his supervisor, who was busy serving other customers. There would be no support from him. If he decided to intervene, he would do so alone. Meanwhile, Eduardo seemed oblivious to Luis's internal battle. With slow movements, he pulled out his wallet and placed a bill on the table, indicating that he was ready to pay. As he did so, Luis caught a glimpse of the company logo on the edge of the card holder. Though it was a brief gesture, it seemed intentional. Luis understood that Eduardo had a plan, and that reassured him somewhat. The young waiter came over to collect the bill. When Eduardo handed him the bill, he looked him in the eye and gave him a slight smile. Luis, still unsure, returned the gesture with an almost imperceptible nod. Deep inside, he hoped the man would find a way to resolve the situation without him having to intervene directly. Clara kept talking, but something in the air was beginning to change. Luis could feel it, although he didn't know exactly what it was. Eduardo sat for a few more minutes after Luis picked up the bill. He glanced one last time at his closed notebook on the table, as if the words he had written gave him the final push to act. He calmly slid his wallet to the center of the table, deliberately leaving his company logo visible on the black leather card holder. It was a subtle but calculated move, meant to attract the right looks. Clara, who had been still entertained by their teasing, noticed the object. At first, she didn't pay much attention to it. However, the logo design looked eerily familiar. She frowned and squinted, trying to recognize it. Her laughter died down to an awkward silence, which caught the attention of her friends. "What's wrong, Clara?" one of them asked. It's nothing," Clara answered, trying to hide it, but her eyes remained fixed on the card holder. Unease began to set in. The logo on that wallet was exactly the same one she had seen on every corporate email, on every official presentation of the company where she worked. But it couldn't be, right? How could that simple, quiet man be part of something so important? Eduardo stood up slowly, with measured movements gathering his things. The slight creaking of the chair as it slid across the floor attracted the attention of more customers, including Clara's group. Before heading towards the exit, Eduardo turned to Luis, who was watching him with a mixture of respect and nervousness. "Thanks for the coffee. It was excellent," said Eduardo, with a calm voice and a friendly smile. The waiter nodded quickly, unable to hide his admiration. "It's a pleasure, sir. Come back whenever you like." Eduardo headed to the checkout to pay. Clara, unable to contain her curiosity, tilted her head toward one of her friends. "Do you think it could be?" she whispered, still in a state of doubt. Her friend looked at her, confused. "The fact that?" Clara didn't answer. Instead, her eyes followed Eduardo to the register, where he handed over his credit card. From where she was standing, Clara could barely make out the name on the card, but it was enough to confirm her worst suspicions. She felt a knot form in her stomach. It was him, Eduardo Montenegro, the owner of the company where she worked. At that moment, a whirlwind of emotions swept through her. Disbelief, shame, and a growing fear of the possible repercussions of her actions. Eduardo, oblivious to the commotion that was beginning to build behind him, retrieved his card, and thanked the cashier with the same kindness he had shown Luis. When Eduardo walked through the door of the cafeteria, Clara stood still, her words stuck in her throat. Her friends, who still didn't fully understand what was happening, tried to ask, but she had no clear answers. She only knew that something was about to change drastically. Clara couldn't sit still. Her mind was in a whirl as she tried to process what had just happened. Eduardo Montenegro, the man she and her friends had ridiculed mercilessly, was none other than the owner of the company where she worked. Her entire body tensed as she imagined the consequences of her behavior. Unable to contain his curiosity, he abruptly stood up from the table and walked over to the counter, where Luis was still collecting a tray. His voice, which was usually firm and arrogant, came out shaky. "Luis, can I ask you something?" she said, trying to maintain her composure. The waiter looked at her, visibly uncomfortable, as if he knew exactly what was coming. "Of course, miss. How can I help you?" he replied, although his tone was cautious. Clara swallowed before continuing. "The man who was here just now. Do you know who he is?" Luis hesitated, but finally decided to answer. He had heard enough of her taunts to know that Clara needed a lesson in reality. "Yes, of course I know. That man is Eduardo Montenegro, the owner of the company where you work." His voice was firm but not aggressive, as if he wanted to emphasize the importance of his words. Clara felt as if the ground had crumbled beneath her feet. Luis's confirmation was a direct blow to her pride and self-confidence. Her face lost color, and for a moment, she was unable to articulate a response. The words she had thrown so lightly at his table now weighed on her like stones. "Are you sure?" he insisted in a voice that was barely audible. Luis nodded, looking at her with a mixture of compassion and reproach. "He is a discreet man, but yes, I am sure. His humility speaks louder than anything else. Perhaps I should remember that." Clara turned slowly towards her table, where her friends were watching her with eyes full of questions. But she no longer had the energy to answer. In her mind, the scenes of what had just happened repeated themselves like a constant echo. The laughter, the hurtful comments, the looks of contempt. Everything came back to her with painful clarity. She decided to act. She left her friends without saying a word and hurried out of the cafe. She looked up and down the street, trying to find Eduardo before he got too far away. She saw him a few meters away, walking calmly towards his car, a discreet model that fit his personality perfectly. Clara ran after him, feeling the shame burning in her chest with every step. When she finally caught up with him, she was breathing hard, but her determination was greater than her exhaustion. "Mr. Montenegro," he said, almost panting. Eduardo stopped and turned to her with a calm expression, though his eyes held a seriousness that made her shudder. He said nothing, allowing her to speak first. Clara looked down, unable to meet his gaze. I want to apologize. I didn't know who you were," and the words stuck in her throat. "I behaved horribly. I'm so sorry." Eduardo remained silent for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. Finally, he answered in a calm and firm voice. "Respect, Miss Clara, should not depend on who someone is or what they possess. What you did today says much more about you than it does about me." Clara nodded, unable to answer. Eduardo looked at her one last time before getting into his car. Without another word, he started the car and drove away, leaving Clara on the sidewalk, alone with her thoughts and the weight of her actions. Clara walked back to the coffee shop in silence, her steps slow and her head down. Her group of friends watched her from their tables, but no one said anything. The expression on Clara's face was enough to convey that something important had happened. She sat in her chair without looking at anyone, her hands shaking slightly as she wrapped around the cup of cold coffee. The atmosphere in the cafe, once light and lively, was now fraught with tension. The murmurs that filled the space had faded, and many of the patrons seemed to be silently reflecting after witnessing the recent events. Luis, from the bar, watched Clara and wondered if she had truly understood the impact of what had happened. A few minutes later, the door of the cafe opened again. Eduardo had returned, with the same calm and simplicity that characterized him. Although some customers looked at him in surprise, he walked towards the center of the place without paying attention to their gazes. With a calm gesture, he asked for everyone's attention. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice firm but calm. "I don't usually speak in public, and even less so in a place like this. But I think what happened a moment ago deserves some reflection." Clara looked up, surprised to see him again. Her heart raced as she realized Eduardo was about to address what had happened. The words of apology she had managed to say outside now seemed insignificant. Eduardo continued, "We live in a world where we too often judge others by what they wear, the way they speak, or what we think they stand for. But every person has a story, a struggle that we can't see with the naked eye. Appearances, as many of you have witnessed today, can be deeply deceptive." A few heads nodded discreetly in the cafeteria, while others kept their gaze fixed on their tables, avoiding eye contact. Clara felt as if every word was directed directly at her, like a mirror reflecting her actions in the starkest way possible. "Respect," Eduardo continued, "is a fundamental value. It should not depend on what someone has, their social position, or any other superficial circumstance. We all deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of who we are or where we come from." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Then in a softer tone, he concluded, "I hope this experience will serve as food for thought for all of us. Not for myself, but for every person we interact with on a daily basis. Because in the end, what defines us is not how we treat the powerful, but how we treat those who we believe have nothing to offer us." Without saying anything else, Eduardo thanked her with a gesture and left the cafeteria again. Clara stood there, feeling Eduardo's words echoing inside her. For the first time, she understood the weight of her actions and the importance of changing. The cafeteria fell into absolute silence after Eduardo left. The words he had spoken hung in the air, like an unavoidable lesson for everyone present. Clara remained motionless in her seat, feeling the weight of every glance cast upon her. She knew she had crossed a line, and that now everyone, including her friends, saw her in a different light. Luis, from behind the counter, watched Clara with a mixture of compassion and expectation. He did not enjoy her discomfort, but he could not deny that something in her seemed to have changed. He decided to act. He prepared a fresh coffee, placed it in a spotless cup, and walked to her table. "Miss Clara, this coffee is on the house," he said softly as he placed the cup in front of her. Clara looked at him, confused at first, but then she understood the gesture. It was a small token of kindness, perhaps a sign that there was still a chance for redemption. Without saying anything, she nodded slightly and wrapped her hands around the cup. The warmth of the coffee reminded her that, despite everything, she could still make a different choice. Meanwhile, Clara's friends remained silent. None of them dared to break the silence, but their looks spoke of a mixture of discomfort and judgment. Clara knew that what had happened would not remain within those four walls. In a company as large as Eduardo's, rumors always found a way to spread. She could already imagine the whispers in the hallways, the reproachful glances, and the possible rejection of her colleagues. But beyond the public embarrassment, there was something deeper that disturbed her. Eduardo's words were not only a criticism of her behavior, but also an invitation to reflect on who she was and how she related to others. Clara understood that his actions had not only exposed her, but had also revealed a facet of her personality that she had never before questioned. As she sipped her coffee, she noticed Luis standing nearby, tidying up empty tables but clearly attentive to her. She was grateful for his gesture, though she didn't know how to express it. Perhaps, she thought, actions would speak louder than words. When he got up to leave, he left a generous bill on the table. Before leaving, he approached Luis. "Thank you," he said, in a more humble tone than he had ever used before. Luis smiled and nodded, seeing in that gesture a glimpse of genuine change. It wasn't long before the story of what happened at the coffee shop began to circulate. A customer who had witnessed everything from a nearby table wrote a post on social media, recounting in detail how a man apparently humble had been the target of ridicule and then revealed as a successful businessman. The publication included a discreet photograph of Eduardo from behind as he left the cafeteria, accompanied by a reflection on respect and humility. The post went viral within hours. Hundreds of comments appeared, condemning Clara's behavior and praising Eduardo's composure. Some people shared similar experiences, and the topic became a public debate about superficial judgment and human values. Clara, upon learning that the story was on everyone's lips, felt a mixture of shame and fear. At the office, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Her colleagues, who had previously admired her for her confidence and charisma, now looked at her with disapproval. Murmurs in the hallways were inevitable, and Clara began to feel isolated. Word had even reached her supervisors, who were wary of interacting with her. Meanwhile, Eduardo remained oblivious to the online commotion. For him, the lesson he sought to impart had been enough. He had returned to his daily routine, busy with the challenges that required his attention. Although some people tried to contact him for interviews or comments, he politely declined each request, remaining true to his discretion. Clara, for her part, began reading the comments on social media. Each word of criticism resonated like an echo of her own reflections. What struck her most were not the accusations of arrogance, but the personal stories others shared, describing how they had been judged by their appearance or background. For the first time, she began to understand the impact her words and actions could have on others. In the midst of the digital storm, Luis was also mentioned in some comments. Someone had noticed his gesture of kindness towards Clara and highlighted it as an example of how to respond with empathy in difficult situations. This filled the young waiter with pride and reaffirmed his decision to act correctly, even when it was easier to stay out of it. For Clara, the next few days were a constant reminder of the consequences of her actions. Every interaction, every glance in the office, reinforced her desire to change. She knew that the real challenge would not be convincing others of her change, but demonstrating it through her actions. Weeks after that day in the cafeteria, Clara was still reflecting on what had happened. She had spent each night evaluating her behavior, remembering Eduardo's words, and facing the impact her attitude had had on others and on herself. Although the criticism at the office had diminished, her reputation remained tarnished. However, Clara decided that she was not going to let that episode define who she was. She was determined to change. Clara looked at him, confused at first, but then she understood the gesture. It was a small token of kindness, perhaps a sign that there was still a chance for redemption. Without saying anything, she nodded slightly and wrapped her hands around the cup. The warmth of the coffee reminded her that, despite everything, she could still make a different choice. Meanwhile, Clara's friends remained silent. None of them dared to break the silence, but their looks spoke of a mixture of discomfort and judgment. Clara knew that what had happened would not remain within those four walls. In a company as large as Eduardo's, rumors always found a way to spread. She could already imagine the whispers in the hallways, the reproachful glances, and the possible rejection of her colleagues. But beyond the public embarrassment, there was something deeper that disturbed her. Eduardo's words were not only a criticism of her behavior, but also an invitation to reflect on who she was and how she related to others. Clara understood that his actions had not only exposed her, but had also revealed a facet of her personality that she had never before questioned. As she sipped her coffee, she noticed Luis standing nearby, tidying up empty tables but clearly attentive to her. She was grateful for his gesture, though she didn't know how to express it. Perhaps, she thought, actions would speak louder than words. When he got up to leave, he left a generous bill on the table. Before leaving, he approached Luis. "Thank you," he said, in a more humble tone than he had ever used before. Luis smiled and nodded, seeing in that gesture a glimpse of genuine change. It wasn't long before the story of what happened at the coffee shop began to circulate. A customer who had witnessed everything from a nearby table wrote a post on social media, recounting in detail how a man apparently humble had been the target of ridicule and then revealed as a successful businessman. The publication included a discreet photograph of Eduardo from behind as he left the cafeteria, accompanied by a reflection on respect and humility. The post went viral within hours. Hundreds of comments appeared, condemning Clara's behavior and praising Eduardo's composure. Some people shared similar experiences, and the topic became a public debate about superficial judgment and human values. Clara, upon learning that the story was on everyone's lips, felt a mixture of shame and fear. At the office, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Her colleagues, who had previously admired her for her confidence and charisma, now looked at her with disapproval. Murmurs in the hallways were inevitable, and Clara began to feel isolated. Word had even reached her supervisors, who were wary of interacting with her. Meanwhile, Eduardo remained oblivious to the online commotion. For him, the lesson he sought to impart had been enough. He had returned to his daily routine, busy with the challenges that required his attention. Although some people tried to contact him for interviews or comments, he politely declined each request, remaining true to his discretion. Clara, for her part, began reading the comments on social media. Each word of criticism resonated like an echo of her own reflections. What struck her most were not the accusations of arrogance, but the personal stories others shared, describing how they had been judged by their appearance or background. For the first time, she began to understand the impact her words and actions could have on others. In the midst of the digital storm, Luis was also mentioned in some comments. Someone had noticed his gesture of kindness towards Clara and highlighted it as an example of how to respond with empathy in difficult situations. This filled the young waiter with pride and reaffirmed his decision to act correctly, even when it was easier to stay out of it. For Clara, the next few days were a constant reminder of the consequences of her actions. Every interaction, every glance in the office, reinforced her desire to change. She knew that the real challenge would not be convincing others of her change, but demonstrating it through her actions. Weeks after that day in the cafeteria, Clara was still reflecting on what had happened. She had spent each night evaluating her behavior, remembering Eduardo's words, and facing the impact her attitude had had on others and on herself. Although the criticism at the office had diminished, her reputation remained tarnished. However, Clara decided that she was not going to let that episode define who she was. She was determined to change. One afternoon, while she was reviewing documents on her desk, she received an unexpected email, an invitation to attend a talk organized by the company where Eduardo would be the main speaker. Clara felt a mixture of nerves and hope. It was the opportunity perfect to show, not only to Eduardo, but also to herself, that she had learned her lesson. The day of the event arrived. Clara chose a simple outfit, far from the ostentatious clothes she usually wore. Upon entering the auditorium, she sat in one of the back rows, watching as her colleagues filled the chairs. When Eduardo appeared on stage, the place fell silent. His presence was still discreet, but his authority was undeniable. During the talk, Eduardo spoke about leadership, empathy, and the power of everyday actions. He never directly mentioned what happened in the cafeteria, but his words resonated deeply with Clara, as if each sentence was directed at her. He talked about how small decisions can transform lives and how respect and humility are essential, regardless of the position someone holds. When the talk was over, the audience stood up to applaud. Clara remained in her seat for a few more seconds, undecided about whether she should approach him or not. Finally, she gathered her courage and walked toward the stage, where Eduardo was talking to some employees. When her turn came, she took a deep breath and greeted him with a firm but humble voice. "Mr. Montenegro, I wanted to thank you for your words, not only today, but also the ones you said to me that day in the cafeteria. They have had a profound impact on me, and I am doing my best to be a better person." Eduardo looked at her for a moment, assessing her sincerity. Then he nodded with a slight smile. "Change begins with reflection, Clara. What matters is what you do with what you have learned. If you follow this path, you don't have to worry about past mistakes. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we get up afterwards." Clara felt a weight lift from within her. His words were not an immediate absolution, but they showed her that change was possible and that it was in her hands to prove it. In the days that followed, Clara set about repairing her relationships with her colleagues and treating everyone with respect, regardless of their position. Small gestures began to make a difference, and although she knew the process would be long, she was willing to go through with it. As for Eduardo, he continued to visit the same cafe, always dressed in the same simplicity. One afternoon, Clara saw him from afar. Although they did not exchange words, they both shared a look of recognition, as if they understood that, in their own way, that day had marked a new beginning for both of them. History reminds us that we should never judge people by their appearance, because each one carries with them a story that we do not know. Humility and respect are essential values that define us as human beings. And you? If you had been in that coffee shop, would you have acted differently? Reflect on this and think about how you can apply this lesson in your daily life. Click on the video on the screen to continue your own journey of self-discovery and learn more valuable lessons like this one. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking and inspiring stories. See you in the next video.